Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. Today's special conversant is Elika Imanaga, who is a university student. She's taking a gap year, she calls it, but she's also been writing on her Substack, cheekily titled Deranged Ranting, which is found at rhymeslikeDimes.substack.com. Look into the description for the link, as rhymes is spelled R-I-M-E-S. I stumbled upon her article examining the usefulness of the argument around CRT and education when the education system is failing, despite what sort of higher order ideologies are being promulgated through it. And I really enjoyed how tight her article was, how well researched it was, and how clear. And I just had this intuition that she would be fun to speak to, and I was in no ways disappointed. I am very proud to be the first person to debut her into this particular taco sphere in which I inhabit. And taco, again, there should be a link in the description, but I'm not going to put it in there, is spelled T-A-L-K-O, talco sphere. So without further ado, here is Elika Imanaga. What does it mean?
It means pear blossom in Japanese. So in Japan, there's just a tendency to name your daughter after whatever month they were born in, or whatever flower is blooming in that month, and mine was pear blossom, so I was named that.
Were you born in Japan?
Yeah, my mom is Japanese, and my dad's, my biological father is British Jamaican, so I was born in Japan, and then my mom remarried, and American.
How long have you been in the States then?
I moved here when I was about 6 months old, but I would go back and forth every year, and I'm a Japanese citizen too, so.
I detect no accent.
Yeah, I went through the K-12 schooling system here, so my English is pretty strong.
And how's your Japanese?
My Japanese is definitely not as strong as my English, but I did take Japanese in university, so it's functional.
Yeah. Do you foresee yourself setting up camp in Japan, or gonna stick in America?
Probably not. I don't think I really like the working world there. The way that works, not really something that interests me. I definitely value kind of like a lot of the liberalism here, so I'd much rather live and work here.
Yeah. As long as we can keep that liberalism, we'll be good.
Yeah.
What do you want to do, career-wise?
Well, before I had been kind of convinced that I'd be going into academia. So, I am in a university program for international studies, which is kind of like interdisciplinary geography. It's like we're learning about politics, sociology, economics, so on and so forth. And I thought that then I would probably continue into working in the private sector. So maybe NGO work or public sector work, working for the state, or, but the current conditions of that sort of work, so the social conditions that orient that work, is something that's making it very unappealing. So, for example, I had done a program at the UN, my second year, I think, of university, where I was taking courses actively there. And, we ran into there were so many rules for how we were allowed to engage with, certain teachers or diplomats that would come into our courses, because to some degree, we were expected to remain culturally sensitive, or, worldly cosmopolitan, maintain that sort of appearance, but that got in the way of a lot of critical discussion. So an example would be that I had an Andorran diplomat as a teacher for a course on women's rights, international women's rights, specifically on the UN's right to protect, which is on protecting women's rights in times of war. And for whatever reason, they had a lot of Saudi Arabians advising on the right to protect, which is kind of it's a bit funny considering the human rights record of the Saudi Arabia and like a lot of these Middle Eastern countries. So it's like, you know, my diplomat professor was definitely critical of the fact that they were allowed to advise on it, but she couldn't really do much aside from complain to her students. And, you know, that was definitely something that made me reconsider whether or not I wanted to head into this direction work-wise, because I don't know if I could do that. I don't think I could.
Maintain diplomacy?
Yeah, in light of obvious discrepancies, I guess, if that makes sense. So I don't know if I could promote ideas that were in conflict with the reality of certain situations, like, you know, working on policy with individuals that are clearly not interested in the same diplomatic goals as you are, I guess, for example. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous, so I hope I'm articulating that well.
No, you're doing great, and the nervousness will just disapparate as time goes on. But isn't that diplomacy, though, is working with people with different goals than you and seeing how to come out on top of the compromise that you're going to have to make no matter what?
I think so, yes, only to the extent that that focus on diplomacy isn't dilatory to the goals of whatever diplomatic project you're working on. So I think, like, say, example, you messaged me to talk about critical race theory, and it's sort of like that itself as like a sort of like critical theory is entrenching itself in the way that diplomacy is working, I guess. So the way that one might speak to someone of a different cultural background in diplomatic discourse, the way in which we kind of like concede to certain cultural differences is changing, I guess, quite rapidly. And I guess I just don't understand diplomacy when it's defined as something, it's defined as just simply getting along with others. Okay. I guess, if that makes sense.
What is diplomacy then, in your perspective?
I think that diplomacy is seeking out mutual goals and trying to facilitate compromise between two parties seeking out those mutual goals. But the problem is when concepts of certain progressive ideas are antithetical to diplomatic goals, or the achievement of diplomatic goals, if that makes sense, because it relies on the denial of certain like incompatibilities between diplomatic parties. So let's say, for example, in the case that I was talking about, at least with the UN, and that you had someone from a more liberal European country trying to make a diplomatic agreement or some kind of decision with someone from a more socially conservative country on something that is objectively socially progressive, which is the right to protect policy that the UN kind of like promotes or published. And the fact that you're not able to kind of like point out the obvious discrepancy in interests between those diplomatic parties, I think is kind of an issue, if that makes sense.
Okay, so how do certain progressive values undermine the ability to locate and discuss areas of disagreement? Is it forming formal blind spots? Is that what you're proposing?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, forming blind spots. I think that it makes it difficult for people to, in the interest of preserving kind of like what progressives would see as sort of cultural sensitivity, they're incapable of pinpointing actual blind spots in any given like reasoning, if that makes sense. Or, you know, so like with the right to protect thing, it would be the fact that like you have countries that have a terrible track record on, you know, human rights in writing policy specifically on international human rights. And you're not able to kind of point out that sort of like fundamental contradiction in interest.
Because of a progressive-ish attitude of cultural sensitivity.
Yes.
So ultimate relativism.
Yes, that's exactly it. And another example would be the fact, like, let's say, for example, with pandemic policy, in the initial months of the pandemic outbreak, there was a huge focus on cultural sensitivity relative to Chinese Americans in the country, despite that being completely antithetical to actual policy that would have been effective in limiting the spread of the virus. So let's say like strict immigration policy at the onset of the outbreak, that was something that was considered culturally insensitive or racist by many progressives, and that really delayed effective policy decisions. Mm-hmm. So that would be like an example of that at like a more domestic level. At an international level, that can be seen in human rights agreements that have parties that are not particularly well representative of those values. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's like kind of an issue.
Sorry if this question hits hard. I don't mean it to hit hard, but if people like you absent themselves from these different institutions because they don't want to deal with these blind spots, then these blind spots won't ever go away. If people of your position aren't in the sausage mill, the sausage isn't going to be made any differently than it's being made.
I guess the fear is that people like me who question sort of like progressive status quo, the progressive status quo in thinking, or seek out these blind spots, I worry that those ideas aren't very popular right now, if that makes sense, in mainstream academia. Mm-hmm. There's not really much that you can do. Like, let's say, for example, I know on your channel you cover the Evergreen State College situation quite extensively. And in a situation like that, even someone of, like Brett Weinstein's qualifications was not able to speak up about what he saw as like extreme inequity at the university, and like the whole sausage mill concept, like it makes sense in that, like, if people who are critical of these systems, like, stay in the system, perhaps the system can change, but what if we're completely rejected from the system, if that makes sense, right? Like, we're not able to be honest in our thoughts.
Okay. So there's one point of view that says that, or there's an analogy about the long march through the institutions. So if we consider the current manifestations of a certain strain of progressivism that is dominant now, it wasn't always dominant, and it took a long time to take over the institutions, and it is taking over institutions. There's two alternatives to combat that. It's to make alternative institutions, or to take a 20-year plan and do a long march or long remarch to take back the institution. What would you think is the best thing to do as somebody who's critical of this ideology? What's the most fruitful thing that you think you could do?
I think a lot of it, coming from the perspective of someone who I was in high school when I think the real ideological takeover happened with like the election of Trump in 2015, 2016. And if I have to be honest, I think that as a teenager, I was becoming inundated into progressive ideas or progressive thinking through like starting in high school. So I think that a lot of it is less so focusing on elite institutions and focusing more on kind of like focusing on adolescent development and encouraging adolescents to be critical of the information that they receive, I think. Mm-hmm. Because as a teenager, I was really encouraged to kind of support liberal progressive beliefs. Especially for me, I didn't grow up in a urban area. I grew up in a kind of like a suburban rural sprawl, like a lot of people in my city growing up, they worked in the agricultural sector and stuff like that. So for me, success was this cosmopolitan, like going to New York, going to university, getting a degree, working in like a really impressive, getting a really impressive public or private sector career, And I thought the only way I could achieve that was believing in progressive liberalism. But, that's not clearly I graduated high school, went through university, or I'm going through university still, and see that it's not all what I was shown, like it's not everything it was shown to me as being, I guess. Like you start to question the sort of like contradictions or like the sort of like logical gaps. So,
what is one of the first gaps or contradictions that you kind of jilted you?
I honestly think the first one had to be going to a gay straight alliance meeting in university. Like during my orientation, I went to one, and the reason why I started questioning it was because of how uncomfortable a lot of the students were made, because they started out the meeting by asking everyone what our favorite anthems were. And I only went as like a straight ally. I don't identify as LGBTQ, but I thought that was really on the nose and a bit offensive to assume that, because these students identify as, LGBTQ, they somehow are inundated in like LGBTQ culture and would thus have, a preferred like gay anthem, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry. The only thing I can think of is YMCA, maybe a Lady Gaga tune. Yeah. Is there like a list of 20 anthems that you can select from? They had them.
Oh,
like, there we go.
I had gone with a friend and she didn't have one, and she herself identified as gay, and she didn't have one. She had no idea what to say, and she was put on the spot and felt so embarrassed, And I knew that I had also bisexual friends who had gone to the club and felt alienated because a lot of the discourse made it out as though they benefited from appearing straight. And that sort of kind of like nitpicking in identity really made me begin to doubt things.
Do you consider yourself to have a racial identity?
Yes.
And how does that operate in the world for you?
I think I'm in a weird spot where, because I'm Blasian, so I'm mixed with Black and Asian, I think every mixed person has this problem where you're not fully considered one or the other. And that really informs my perspective on, say, like minority issues, because I don't really see the Black community as being wholly exempt from being racist. And that's something that I think puts me in a really bad position just ideologically already. Like I've experienced a lot of anti-Asian racism from Black people growing up, and I experienced a lot of anti-Black racism from Asian people growing up. It wasn't like racism wasn't something unique to each group, if that makes sense. Like they were both willing to see me as like sort of like an alien in their community or some other, because I wasn't fully one or the other, if that makes sense.
How have you navigated going from that kind of that cultural conditioning and that cultural response to individual relationships? Was that a big detriment in developing friendships with individuals?
I'd say in early childhood, yes, but a lot of it also had to do, I think I had really good parents too that were really, if I were to take on some sort of like belief that my race was a first and foremost concern of my identity, they would have shot that down immediately. My stepfather, who is an African American, grew up in a segregated America, and most of his obviously like he experienced racism. He'd been like wrongly, like he had been arrested just on the basis of his race before, but I don't think that he encouraged me to then perceive myself on a racial basis solely. If anything, he thought that was the reason why he experienced discrimination prior to desegregation, was that he was seeing himself and the rest of the world was seeing him as exclusively his race. And that was really beaten into me as a kid that I'm more than that. And I don't think that's encouraged I don't think that sort of individualism is being encouraged in people anymore.
There's evidence that it's actively being, as you say, beaten out of them. In a way. So what is your starting point then? Your conception of where do you start? What do you base everything on for yourself? If it's not race, but there are these identity issues, what's the foundation that you build? your conception of yourself from?
I think I define myself academically first and foremost, as in I've always done decently well in school, and I've prided myself on being able to think quite well, and I'd like to continue to define myself by my thoughts and opinions on certain things or subjects. I feel largely uncomfortable when, like, say my race is set to be, I guess, like some overwhelming element of my identity. I think it informs a lot of my beliefs and perspectives, but I really would rather not be defined exclusively by it. Mm-hmm. You know, if I were to be referred to as the Blasian girl, I probably wouldn't be very happy with that.
That sounds at once like a slur and something fun to say, but I don't think I should be saying that, so I'm not going to say that.
Sure, either. I'm not really sure what the domain of, like, okay language is anymore. I'm not sure what we can and can't say.
So, speaking about thinking and wanting to append your identity, or at least your social identity, to your thoughts, you started a Substack. There's not that many articles on it. There is one on parsing through CRT, the CRT discussion on a kind of a national level, Republican versus Democrat. But there's also this really fascinating essay that I didn't get a chance to read all the way through, but it was really a fascinating take on time and how conceptions of time inform ideas of conservatism and progressivism. What caused you to, where did that idea germinate from?
Well, a lot of it had to do with trying to understand why people connected fascism to Trump-style populism. And that was something that had always confused me. And I got really interested in learning more about fascism and fascist beliefs and hyper-conservatism and, like, a lot of, like, new right beliefs, like that entire, like, sphere of, like, right-wing ideology, because I don't think that the liberal definition of, like, you know, blanket fascism was very accurate or productive. And then when I got into reading about it, I was introduced to more of, like, more discourse and more ideas proliferated by, say, like Steve Bannon, who was a really major advisor to the Trump administration and early on. And a book that he was a huge proponent of was The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe, and I think, I don't remember the first name, but it was just Strauss and Howe. A good way to describe it would be that historical events are continually associated with recurring generational personas, and each generational persona unleashes a new sort of political era that lasts around 20 to 25 years, which is kind of like the average length of time someone might have a political career or a significant, like, political career. So let's say, for example, you know, Gen X comes to adulthood, and then they make decisions, political decisions for the rest of the country for the next 20 to 25 years. And then after that, you have a reactionary movement of the same generational cycle. So I think an interesting one would probably be, so the baby boomer generation, most of their politics are a reaction to what their parents kind of, like, inundated them into.
What's the climate that or the values that you see a lot of your cohort reacting to?
I think a lot of it, especially, you know, talking to, let's say, my younger siblings, for example, like, they are beginning to react to, younger kids are beginning to react to, I think, millennial beliefs, as in, like, millennial beliefs in progressivism and liberalism. And I think a good example would probably be Nick Fuentes, who is a really major figure on the extreme right. I think that as much hate as he gets for being so reactionary, I think he is a product of a new generation reacting to millennial progressivism. And I think it was an inevitable thing.
Do you buy into, or how much do you buy into, a overreactionary movement? Like a pendulum that's going to swing too far the other way or something like that? Do you see that these things kind of end up stabilizing themselves, or do you foresee or worry of some sort of crisis state coming to the frame?
In the fourth turning, the whole logic is that fourth turning, it works sort of in 4 generational cycles, and then there's a crisis that redoes the entire paradigm, the national paradigm. So I think that what will happen is that we we'll likely see another major crisis. You know, I mean, like you can make the supposition that the current pandemic and all of the political fallout that's come to light because of it is the current crisis that my generation is living through, but I'm not really sure.
What's your perspective on the unrest of 2020? That seemed to involve a lot of people your age.
I found it really frustrating, I think. That's probably the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of it. I thought that the social unrest was sort of media driven. And I think that a lot of people my age, people my age spend most of their time online, you know, we're preoccupied by our phones. So I think that a lot of it was built on sensationalism or online sensationalism, and you had people acting out what they saw online, and that was like really actually quite scary.
Yeah, there was no it was a pretty phenomenal feedback loop of just replicating a certain sort of behavior. Have you found any drive to speak to or for what this is a big question, so it might be stupid, but do you have a drive to get the bearings on what's going on and enough tools to start to speak for and to your generation or what America should be focusing on? And if so, what do you think you would like to push into the conversation at this point in time?
I would say that I am very interested in like critically analyzing what's going on, especially relative to how it affects people my age. And I've written a bit, especially during the initial protests. I think the initial ones, they happened in New York in the summer of 2020. And I had been writing a little bit about that and published on my old Medium account on the sort of like logical incoherence of a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff like that. But one big thing is it's a little bit difficult to kind of like to disseminate ideas, especially new ones or ones that might be controversial now, because I think that the entire industry for academic ideas has become like very commercialized. So like what is the most marketable ideas tend to gain the most traction, and certain ideas just aren't marketable, so I don't really know what to do about that. So for people my age, I don't really think being extremely critical of Black Lives Matter is very appealing. So that's not really something I wouldn't know what to do there. I think people who are much older than me are more inclined to hear criticism or, you know, contentious like beliefs, but people my age aren't. I don't really know what to do about that.
You can always become a thoughtful thought or some sort of intellectual influencer.
I could, but I feel, yeah, I could. I definitely could. There are definitely people out there that do well, but I worry that just becomes noise in the entire, like it's noise. It's not, I don't know if it's productive. Okay.
So what's something that you're toying with now? You're still in university.
Yes, I'm taking a gap year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did it just start this past year, or are you about to end it?
Yeah, I'm about to end it. It started with the onset of the pandemic because I thought that I just found that online school didn't really. It wasn't really productive for me. I didn't really enjoy it, and I didn't want to continue to pay the tuition and get an education that I thought was, you know, incompatible with how I learn.
And what did you do in that gap year? Mostly
write. A lot of it's just writing. A lot of it, actually, my father, he had passed away over the pandemic, so a lot of it was working, helping my working to help my mom out. Yes. So, yeah.
And what was the writing focused on? I guess you've published some, but what kind of voice are you developing, or what genre is it? Very thoughtful, very well researched, the ones that I've read.
Oh, thank you. I think hypercritical, would probably be one. I think the voice I'd like to have would be at least play devil's advocate for a lot of progressive ideas, or at least be able to kind of like analyze things as though I was an alien approaching this topic, I guess. I think a lot of discourse between progressivism and conservatism now is coming from the perspective of someone who defines himself as either being exclusively conservative or exclusively progressive. And I think that we need a lot more people who come from the center, observing things as objectively as possible. I think that bias is something that's sort of an intellectual disease right now, and it's apparent, ever so apparent in basically all facets of like academic writing or intellectual writing. It's really hard to avoid, especially in especially now that we're living in kind of like a market that like really seeks out bias. You know, bias will make you money now, and I really just don't like that.
How do you confront bias in yourself? How do you wield it properly? Unless you're free of bias, and if you are, what's the trick?
I don't think I'm free of bias. I think no one is, but what you can do is just remain aware of that fact, and I don't think a lot of people are willing enough to admit that. Admitting to bias is probably the first step to getting rid of bias, at least in conversation, because I think if you can admit to your biases, you're able to speak more honestly with other people. And I think a lot of people are also intolerant of critique now, especially academic critique, and laying out your insecurities and biases or sort of like preferences in your writing quite clearly, I think enables more comprehensive discussion of the ideas too. As in, like, I think it's very wrong for people to kind of like present their biases as facts, or present their biases as anywhere potentially factual or truthful, or you know, say like potentially like meaningful, like another meaningful interpretation of reality or something, when it's really just bias. So, sorry.
No, continue.
Oh, yeah, I was like, an example would probably be the fact that I do have, I think, I try to define myself exclusively by the way I think and my ideas, but at the end of the day, I am biased towards, you know, like racial sensitivity or like minority politics. I am biased towards that. As much as critical as I am of Black Lives Matter, I tend to be sympathetic to a lot of their cause. But that's like something I have to be able to admit to myself, that I'm biased because I am non-white.
There might be an incredible amount of opportunity open to one who is very critical of just for example, Black Lives Matter, the manifestations of Black Lives Matter, the contradictions of the Black Lives Matter, and then salvaging the best parts of that. And the breaking down of that is going to attract a certain audience, and you'll probably lose them by the time you get to your real goal, but you will probably salvage a lot of people. You probably will participate in the project of cleaning up the messiness that you see in what you are sympathetic to, the movements that you're sympathetic to.
Like, I am extremely sympathetic to the issue of police brutality in the country, but I don't know if defining it on a racial basis is as accurate as Black Lives Matter activists claim it is. And that would be a good example. I think a lot of it has more to do with poverty. And that would just be an example of it. And, you know, I think we should be able to salvage that criticism of police institutions, but really try to remove the racial connotations or the racial interpretation of it all too, because I just don't think that's productive. I wish we were more able to do that now.
And yet you said that one of your biases is racial sensitivity. Could you define that and what you think is the proper way for one to develop that and manifest that?
Well, racial sensitivity is really hard to define because it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and particularly because I'm not inclined to agree with the progressive definition of it, it becomes even harder to really articulate. But for me, racial sensitivity in that I am definitely one to be less welcoming to, say, supremacist ideas. So, you know, there's definitely like a debate, I think, in especially with like people who are free speech absolutionists, as to whether or not there should be any sort of like legislation limiting the beliefs or behaviors or actions or assembly of people who have, white supremacist beliefs. And part of me wants to say that part of me wants to tend to agree with the free speech absolutionists and that their rights to assemble and to kind of like, I guess, congregate on the basis of their ideas. I think that that's something that should be enabled by the state and protected by the state. But at the same time, to me as a minority, I find that very scary. So it's very hard for me to kind of like, it's hard for me to be wholly sympathetic to like, let's say, for example, like white supremacy, but I also don't really think that I agree with the progressive take on policing it, I guess, or limiting it. And that would probably be a good example of my issue with defining kind of like racial sensitivity or what we can do to have a better, more racially integrated or more tolerant society. But yeah, to develop racial sensitivity, I think a lot of it just has to be willingness to be tolerant of differences or to learn about differences between one another. And a lot of it's interpersonal. I think a lot of racial sensitivity conversations are more about interpersonal relationships. So let's say, for example, if someone were to proliferate an idea that I thought was maybe negative about African American people or Asian people, that would be something I should speak to them about on an interpersonal basis. I don't really think that's something that needs to be politicized.
I believe it was Jonathan Haidt, or maybe it was just a study that he was referencing, but he said that training in communication is actually more beneficial in the work environment than training in diversity and implicit bias. Communication actually helps facilitate tearing down those barriers, whereas the opposite way tends to entrench them, especially when you misuse the concepts of privilege and so on.
Are you familiar with the book, what is it, Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier?
Yeah, I've had her on my channel a couple times.
I know there in the introduction section of her book, she talks actually a lot about how people my age, around 21 and under, they are losing communicative capacity, as in we're probably one of the most poorly socialized generations. And I think it's very obvious in how the recent protests and like sort of like civil rights movements have been like conceptualized by people my age. I think a lot of them are turning interpersonal things into political statements, or some things that should be interpersonal issues into something that needs to be legislated or something like that. And I think that's very like demonstrative of like the lack of social like etiquette and social like emotional capacity people my age have. Everyone spends time online. People will avoid face-to-face contact. It's very difficult for people to actually have conversations in person, or difficult conversations in person now. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going to come of that.
How have you become self-conscious, and then how do you manage your online life?
Oh, it's really difficult. I think, especially with the pandemic, you're not able to kind of see your friends in person. So, people my age, we really congregate online, and I think people end up sequestered into like really different like sort of cliques too, and they end up in echo chambers of belief systems and agreement. You can really kind of like curate who your friends are now. And that's really not great, I think.
Especially when it's organized along the vector of agreement and disagreement, which is a very poor bandwidth for human connection. It's just one vector. Yeah.
I think the amount of stress it caused for me to try to maintain friendships on the basis of like agreement and disagreement, I think that's really what broke me, because I just don't agree. I'm disagreeable. I have a disagreeable personality. So like a big example would be at my university, where all the social expectation or the status quo at my university is to have your pronouns in your bio for all your social media, to let people know that you want to normalize the asking of pronouns, or like to normalize the whole like constructivist idea of gender identity, and that, you know, you can't assume someone's gender, so you have to project your gender to other people with pronouns, and you especially should advertise your social media as that. And I don't have my pronouns on my bio. I think I look visibly female. I don't really think I need to define myself by that, but that automatically, I think, puts me at odds with so many people at my university without even having a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Is that just you're willing to take that hit?
Yeah, I'm willing to take that hit. I don't think that I could sustain really good friendships with people like that anyway. So I don't worry about.
What if your entire generation goes that way? Are you willing to just cling to us Gen Xers and hope for a subsequent generation that will accept you on your own terms?
Yeah, I'll probably either just hang out with people my mom's age, or just maybe move back to more conservative country like Japan.
Oh man.
Yeah, like it's getting to the point where it's sort of like it's like insanely hard to actually navigate social relationships, especially in my age group. I have friends who are still hiding who they voted for. You know, like they're terrified of letting people know because they don't want them to know that they didn't vote Democrat. Even people who voted Libertarian, they're scared.
That's a powder keg if your generation is split along the visible and very ideological. Like there's this very visible, very ideological group, and then there's this secret network group that's probably going to be growing in resentment more and more as time goes on. Yeah. This is a bad example, but it's still kind of a sample of your generation. If you look on TikTok, there's some pretty phenomenally out there ideas going on in a very demanding tone, in a very authoritarian tone, and that could cause a lot of stress just within your generation.
Yeah. Oh, on TikTok, oh my gosh, I have a memory of there was a male feminist account on TikTok, and they were basically doing something like I thought was virtue signaling. Like it was like a sort of unnecessary, I hate men too sort of thing. And I think I made a joke about that, and I just got dogpiled on by like thousands of like people my age that were like telling me that I was like a pick-me who wanted to appeal to men by like rejecting feminist values. And all I did was just think that his video was a bit ridiculous and like excessive, and that's about it. But you know, that's the sort of environment I live in. You know, people put trigger warnings in front of like basically everything now. Like you can scroll on TikTok and you can find trigger warning, I talk about a dream in this video. A trigger warning, I talk about school. Like, you know, it's so hard, and it gets harder and harder the younger you talk to, like the younger groups you talk to, you know. Like talking to someone around, you know, in high school now, even as a college student, it's really difficult.
Because of the rules that they're putting upon you, or the narrowness of their thought?
The sort of social rules and what is considered, you know, polite and not polite. Like etiquette's really changing, you know, assuming.
And it's really enforced too. So it's very mutable and very not immutable, but like it's like the worst of both worlds. So it's always changing, but you always have to be right or else you're screwed. It's
kind of like, I mean, like there's a real reason why I think progressives tend to target children. I know that's a really weird way to put it, because I don't like to suggest that progressives are like, you know, predators of some kind, but progressive ideas do well when you disseminate them amongst students, because kids are very cliquey. Kids are just naturally really cliquey, and they're like sociopathic. They will bully each other. You know, like I went to school in 2016, and there were some Trump supporters at my school, and they got bullied. Like there was no way they could actually, they couldn't have like a normal social life at school. There's no way. They would get mocked. I went to my school is majority Black and Latino. So like, yeah, like the white Trump supporter kids definitely were at risk of physical violence.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I was taught that was okay, and I thought that was okay when I was about
taught by somebody with authority, or just in your social group?
It's a mix, honestly. I think we all kind of access the same sort of media, So we were all watching like The Daily Show, you know, like I remember I used to record The Daily Show every night because I thought it was like subversive. Like, I don't know, to a teenager, The Daily Show is very subversive and new because it makes fun of all the people your parents support. So I was really into that, and like a lot of my friends were really into it. I know people campaigned, because I'm from New Jersey, we like were, you know, campaigning for like Phil Murphy, who was the new Democrat-elect governor. We were also doing stuff like we had anti-gun protests at my school, so we had a March for Your Lives protest. And, you know, there was one pro-gun kid who brought his gun to school to like, it was like a whole thing. Like there was just so much conflict going on about like the culture wars really invaded my high school. It was like insane, you know? Oh, and I was in Model Congress and AP government in school, and it was just even worse there. You know, kids hated each other.
Oh, okay. So this goes back to our original conversation. How do you have diplomacy? How do you start to form diplomacy in such an environment where one side is the devil, basically, and the other side is completely right, and yet not really thinking through its own position and enforcing these etiquette and then also changing the etiquette all the time? It just doesn't seem like a stable situation at all. How would you conceive of starting to try to stabilize that? What's the middle path?
I think a lot of it is focusing on sort of non-identity related. It's removing sort of like features of like identities, as in like removing sort of like the preoccupation with race, the preoccupation with gender, the preoccupation with like sort of respecting like these elements of identity, and focusing more on like the innate things that we all have in common. Like, I don't know, like I'm sure me and that Trump supporter kid at my school, then high school, you know, I didn't particularly get along with him, but we probably had way more just general interest in terms of books that we like to read, or like just TV shows that we like to watch. And like that's like really something that's human value that gets lost in a lot of the, you know, sort of like animosity there. You know, like I remember my senior year of high school, I went to a Model Congress event where we were all split into different parties. So there was a Democrat group, a Republican group, and a Libertarian group, and these were all like fifth. I think the youngest person there would have been 14, the oldest person there 18. And the Democrat group, they hated the Republican group. There was just so much animosity between the two. But I ended up being put in a really bad position because I did get along with a lot of the Republican kids. I really liked a lot of them. They're nice. They're funny. I thought that the Libertarian kids were funny. I thought that some of the perspectives they had on society were pretty entertaining. But, you know, you can't really, like, making any sort of compromise with them was like frowned upon because of their beliefs and because of like the natural disagreements we had. So I don't know.
It seems like you're going to be forced out of progressive circles and being connected to the Democrat. And do you foresee yourself just gravitating towards more and more conservative ideas yourself because those are the only people that you can get along with and have conversations with? Or do you foresee yourself having some sort of integrity beyond the cliquishness? And how do you maintain integrity and all that social whirlwind?
I think a lot of it is really learning to accept that you can't make everyone happy. And that's definitely something that I've like had trouble with, you know, like there's no way that I can continue to publish what I'd like to publish and then have everyone respect and like me. There will always be people that desperately dislike what I have to say, and that's something you just have to get over and move forward, you know, like to take the, you know, mature route and ignore it. And I think that's probably more productive. So yeah, it's really hard. I think there are a lot of people that tend to have like centrist beliefs or alternative left-wing beliefs that end up being forced into conservative spaces, even if they are fundamentally ideologically like opposed to them, just because the conservatives are more inclined to allow for controversial discourse, you know.
Do you think that might liberalize conservatism?
Oh yeah, but then with the liberalization of conservatism, you're going to see a really bad reactionary movement, I think.
Could you expound on that, please.
So another thing would be, I think there is a growing sector of like Black conservatives. I think Black conservatism is actually doing pretty well. It's
and Latino,
growing.
yeah.
Yeah, because I think a lot of Black and a lot of like Latino people are realizing that like progressive ideas aren't necessarily compatible with the way that they want to live their life or the way that they see the world. But, you know, you have like these white conservatives or white reactionaries absolutely rejecting the idea of like Black conservatism. So, you know, I think there's like a real notion or a fear of like the great replacement or something like that among white reactionaries, this concern that, you know, by allowing African American or like just general minority input into more reactionary or conservative spaces, it's therefore like then kind of like mutating the conservatives or like the reactionary movement into something that leans more progressive, I guess. It's really weird. There are a lot of really weird beliefs. So
if there is, so we're talking about a specific content. Well, let's just be very general for the moment, just to distill it down into chess pieces. If there is a unit on the right that is based in identity just as much as the progressives are, but in the one way that you're not supposed to, because it strikes fear into the hearts of Americans. If they are somehow marginalized within the conservative ranks, and even just kind of left out to dry, because the game theory is to make the most inclusive conservative party possible in order to win, you know, a stable political position. Won't the marginalization of that one unit of the conservative just not really have much standing because it's not politically viable in the broader sense? Like, how do you see that as a problem? Do you think that it will grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, or do you think from my perspective, it's rather marginal? But maybe it's not. I know that there's discourse and stuff, but it's just not I just don't see it as being stable for a broader conservative coalition.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with how conservatism is kind of organized fundamentally. Okay. I talk about it in that one essay on like the difference between like time perception and conservatism and progressivism, and a lot of it has to do with conservatism relying on the preservation of a pre-existing social order, or the idea that we must return to what was once was. And then progressivism is more inclined to see the world as like a constant, like they see everything as a straight line extrapolation of recent past, and that we're constantly moving forward. And I think that is something that causes those like, that's like a fundamental difference that kind of like leads into that problem. Like conservatism isn't something that can constantly grow. It's fundamentally, I think, like antithetical to the beliefs of conservatism, that we need to maintain this previous order. So constant like there's always going to be conflict over expansion in conservative spaces, I think, or ideological expansion.
There's another conception of conservatism as progressivism with the brakes on. So there is progress, but it's the conflict against progress is what is slowing down progress so that human beings can adapt, and then we can actually test whether these new mutations in the social environment are viable over time, right? So it's not that, the trad. I don't know what the Groypers think, but the hardline conception of conservatism as the retreat into the past, I think that is a ideological pressure that's balanced against the pursuit of the ultimate progress. And there's some sort of mixture of those two where you get a massive amount of stability and not progress, but opportunity for individuals to maximize their potential within a stable and yet slightly changing social environment.
I think that's actually kind of why progressivism has been able to take such a hold on like kind of like the public sphere, or public like just like thought, because conservatism will always be kind of like, will suffer from internal conflict from that. You know, there is the hardline traditionalists, the hardline conservatives, and then there are those to which conservatism means something that is a bit more cautionary or like cautious, right? And they will always be at conflict, and I think that itself is dilatory to any like conservative thought or conservative like productive progress. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Conservative hold on society.
Yeah.
You know, they can never agree on what conservatism should be, but progressives seem to be more inclined to be able to organize their thoughts into like one coalition.
Mm-hmm. But as we've been talking about, there's outliers and there's problems within the progressive way of thinking. And
and I think the people that are rejected, they end up kind of falling to the wayside, defaulting to a third party that is unable to gain real traction in like the bipartisan system we have, or they end up kind of like subsumed by conservative thought. And again, conservative thought gets caught between that, you know, are we cautious of progressivism or are we anti-progressivism? And there's like kind of like, that's like a whole other dialogue that they have. So I don't know. I feel like I definitely probably am more cynical of the discourse between like progressivism and conservatism, and the capacity for conservatism to be at all kind of like mobilized in the same way progressivism has. But there are probably people more optimistic than I am out there, so I don't know. I don't really see moderate beliefs becoming popular with people in my age group either. So I think that fringe beliefs get more encouraged.
Do you think you all will kind of chill out as you age, or are you just do you think the internet's gonna be like this wonder drug and keep you guys on the edge of your seat for the next 40 years?
I think that a lot of people are probably gonna make really poor decisions that they can't really take back. I think a lot of like progressive issues right now are sort of more severe than a lot of people realize, and I think that there's going to be a real strong movement of like regret in the next 10 years. As people in my age group reach adulthood, they're going to start regretting some of the things that they said or believed, I think. As in, like, you know, there are people that are cutting off family members for having beliefs that they see as being problematic or, you know, like overly conservative or reactionary. And I think then 10 years we're going to see people really regret that, and I think then you're going to see maybe more moderate beliefs come back into popularity. I think, let's say for example, like the whole recent push for, you know, gender constructivism, I lend myself to the belief that people should be able to kind of like explore their gender identity to the extent that they want to. I don't think that there are any, like, basically, I think it's gender identity is protected as a negative right. You have the right to kind of dress the way that you want to in the United States. But at the same time, now you have the medicalization of that, and you're seeing a lot of people go through procedures on a political, like, under a political, like, basis, you know, that they can't take back.
You know, going back to generations, the boomers were formed in a very novel media environment. TV came along. You know, their parents had radio. Then there was the Great War. So there was this looming historical thing going on. There was communism and Americanism, and they grew up in a specific environment. And then when they had their flowering in the late 60s and early 70s, they did a lot of protesting and they did a lot of activism themselves. And then they chilled out and they got to work. And then we had the 80s. And my generation, Gen X, we grew up in a specific media environment where we kind of defined ourselves in terms of fashion, in terms of art, in terms of music, not so much in political beliefs. I mean, political beliefs were an accessory, but they weren't the central thing. And from speaking with you, I'm skipping the millennials for the time being because, you know, whatever. Zoom, but with your generation, you really seem like the politicized generation. It seems like what we have done and the media environment that what we have done, not intentionally, by focusing on certain things, and what the internet has done by collating information in a certain way, has turned everything about you all into politic, into, I guess I need to define what I mean by politic. But it's all social status in a very, and it's always already been social status, but in a very, very recognizable, I don't want to say shallow, but very surface level way. And it just seems like there's danger there, and there's worry from my generation for your generation. And at the same time, it's wonderful to see people like you who are not represented because you aren't crazy, so we don't make fun of you when you make your TikTok videos. I don't know. I haven't gone through your TikTok, so maybe
I mean,
getting
what
ahead
you're
of myself.
talking about media-wise, that's like something that they really, really talk about in The Fourth Turning. I think that was a book, like the book that I brought up earlier, where I'm more relaxed now, so I think I might be better able to explain it. It's just that, like, the Fourth Turning just describes the last in a four-stage generational cycle that Strauss and Howe have, like, identified. So, you know, the actual turnings are the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis being the fourth turning, and the crisis stage being what they suggest my generation is living through, which is, you know, so the generational high, like the social cycle of the high is when social institutions, political institutions are very strong and public individualism is very weak. So as like a collective entity, like society is very confident about where it should go and where it should progress towards. But those outside the sort of like center majority feels stifled by conformity. And then as a new generational cycle comes to adulthood, then you enter the awakening era of like this, you know, four-stage sort of like cycle where institutions are attacked in the name of like autonomy. People are tired of social discipline. I think a good example would probably be kind of the transition between the 50s to the 60s. I think there's like a huge like social revolution there, you know. I think there's this huge sexual revolution, I think, which was a product of those who had grown up in like a very conformist 50s culture, then reaching adulthood and really revolting against that. And then after that era, you have the unraveling, in which institutions are very much weak and very distrusted. And I think for at least my generation, I grew up in that sort of unraveling, which would have been like the economic collapse of 2008. Where people my age grew up to see their parents like crying over, you know, their financial statements. And then as my era reaches adulthood, we're in the crisis stage. And that's when you see a political generation that's interested in destroying institutional life and rebuilding it to a new paradigm. And that's happened over and over again. And Strauss and Howe are like historians that like basically analyze this. And I think it's very interesting.
The rhetoric that I'm worried about, and the behavior that I'm worried about, is the disrupting and dismantling rhetoric that is now in my state of Washington being inserted into the state. The state itself is now, we're going to destroy ourselves. But, you know, it's very easy to topple things. It's very difficult to rebuild. And we cannot afford destroying things completely, because of the amount of reliance we have on each other is phenomenal. And I think that a lot of people, especially in your generation, I don't mean to talk down to you because it's also in my generation, we are not humanly capable of conceptualizing just how connected we are. On an electrical grid, nuclear power plants, the roadways, the globalization. We can't just dismantle things. Yeah. So I really, it's playing with fire, but at the same time, there might be hidden in your generation already a group of people who are hungry to get to rebuilding, who don't really care so much about the dismantling and can let it do its thing because you're more thirsting for the opportunity to build. Do you get that sense? Do you have that sense? Do you want to foster that sense?
I don't know what rebuilding looks like, I guess, to a certain degree, because it depends on what institutions collapse, I think, in the next coming decade.
But you do see a collapse coming.
I do see it. I think a collapse is going to be inevitable. I genuinely sometimes worry that we're living through a second Weimar Republic.
Oh no. Yeah. Okay.
just because of the accelerated liberalism and then the, reactionary response that's like kind of like gaining traction and sort of like the extreme political division, the sort of kind of like, I don't want to say it's like a secret police or something like that, but like, it's very difficult to kind of like discern government intention now. I think that like it's definitely really worrying. I think that a crisis is going to be inevitable at some point, especially with the hyperinflation we're seeing post-pandemic. So, like I don't really know. I'd be interested. I mean, like, if I were to be, an individual that was at all significant during what would be the, rebuild of like institutions post like collapse, I don't really know what I'd start with because I don't really know what will collapse. I guess I don't know if it's going to be social institutions. I don't know if it's going to be economic systems like the financial institutions. There's a lot of new like sort of like interest in decentralized finance, the decentralization of currency, the entire like a monetary system revolution. And we saw that with like sort of like the battle between like the was it retail traders on Wall Street bets, kind of like trying to fight with like, hedge funds.
Hedge funds, yeah.
Yeah, on Robinhood. Like, I don't know what institutional sector is going to fall first, and I don't know what then the response would be. I mean, okay. I think there are definitely people preparing for like an entire like societal downfall, breakdown, like, civil war. I don't really think people my age have like the hard skills or like technical skills needed to actually do anything of value.
I've seen the footage of Antifa, and I don't think that they'd really actually last in a fight where they were being fought back against.
Yeah, there was like the whole Chaz Chop thing that like developed in Seattle, and they had a garden, and like none of them had any basic gardening skills. Like, what are they going to do in the next? Like, I know I've seen like a lot of communists talk about like how there's going to be a communist revolution. And like, what jobs are people going to have in like the American communist system? Like, we don't need diversity officers. I don't know if they realize that, like, say what you will about like communist regimes, like they do require a lot of technical skills to be productive. So we can't just have people who know how to write well. You probably need a lot of people who are working in like blue collar labor, and they're not interested in communism.
Yeah, actual communism doesn't have that many genders as they imagine.
Yeah, communism is not anti-work, and that's like there's like a very weird anti-work movement associated with like really extreme like left-wing beliefs, in spite of the fact that most extreme left-wingers probably would really dislike those that were opposed to doing hard labor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of contradictions there.
I'm good at writing. I don't have the technical skills to build a house, and I know that. That's okay. It's okay, but that doesn't mean I'd support like a breakdown of society. I think right now we're seeing like a breakdown of social institutions more so than like I think that the state and the financial sector are doing whatever they can to retain control. And I think that's really obvious in how like sort of like the Biden administration has been going about a lot of like the sort of like reactionary conservatives. They're doubling down on like capital, like the militarization of the Capitol. They're expanding like sort of Capitol Police presence in like Florida, for example, because they see that as like being like a kind of breeding ground for like extreme beliefs, extreme Trump beliefs or something like that. So yeah, like clearly like they're individuals and within like kind of like the institutional like bureaucracy or whatever, they seem to see that there is like sort of like a real destabilization going on, but they're more able to control that than like social institutions are. So yeah,
Where are you gonna head? What's up next? What's in the works? What's your grand plan? Who are you?
In terms of writing, or in terms of just
that's what you want to be defined as, so let's do that.
I think, I've been working on a few different pieces, but I'm not really sure where I'm going to focus on next. I think one essay that I've been working on was on Black exceptionalism and the incoherence of like American racial identity now. But I'm like definitely afraid to publish it because I don't want to be called a racist or accused of being anti-Black when I'm clearly, mixed with Black. So I don't have any sort of like inclination towards hating Black people. But I think a lot of people have like tried to define like Black Lives Matter as being racially supremacist. You know, there are a lot of conservatives, or at least
From
a lot
within
of
or without? Okay, from without.
yeah, a lot of like contrarians who tend to believe that like Black Lives Matter promotes like a black supremacist beliefs, but it's really not supremacy. I would say it's more exceptionalism. The idea that African Americans are unique in their historiography. They're a chosen people within like this nation state apparatus, that their historical subjugation has made them a sort of chosen people. You know, it runs in contrast to a lot of exceptionalist narratives that we've already seen before. Like there's German exceptionalism, Japanese exceptionalism, white American exceptionalism that we saw during the Manifest Destiny, like American kind of like American West. But I think the black exception, like it's hard to like it's not able to kind of function in the same way because there's no credible avenue they have to suggesting that the United States is at its core a black state. So an exceptionalist narrative within a pluralistic political landscape provides it kind of a more like unique narrative. So the prescription of black exceptionalism is oriented around like politics of resentment or grievance, and it's constrained within a black versus white dichotomy. So that's probably something I'd be working on. That's like definitely something I'm really curious on, because I see it as being like one of the most concerning elements of like contemporary political discourse, and one that I think a lot of writers are afraid to touch because of its racial implications. Yeah.
I think you should definitely, while not throwing caution to the wind or being reckless, definitely follow your curiosity. You have the beginnings of a... You have the beginnings of somebody who could actually bring discourse to places where it hasn't gone yet, and that's the most important thing in discourse, is to go there.
Yeah, like with the last essay I wrote on CRT, I was like really actually quite nervous to publish it because I was very worried that it wouldn't be well received by the left and it would get the attention from people on the right I wasn't necessarily interested in receiving attention from. Like there's a very hard line that I'm trying to toe between being seen as sympathetic to white supremacist beliefs and being sympathetic to progressive beliefs when I'm sympathetic to, I'm pretty neutral between them. I don't know. I think the whole CRT conversation in schools is sort of insane, but it needs to be legitimized in conversation, as in like opposite, like there needs to be like legitimate contrarian, like, or like oppositional discourse that isn't oriented around just being a white reaction. So,
and it's actually the actual reaction is not a white reaction. It's a liberal reaction. It's people across races that are manifesting discontent with the indoctrination of our education.
Yeah, I think it's definitely getting. I think a lot of progressive liberals are really denying the fact that like critical race theory or critical theory in general is like kind of making its way into K through 12 education. And I think the public reaction or the liberal reaction, you're seeing the silent majority finally react to it because people really don't like having their children be indoctrinated. People really don't like things once it starts to affect their children. So,
well, I mean, this is two sides to this particular thing. Even if the parents win over the teachers' unions or the diversicrats that are setting up shop in the schools, as we've pointed out in this conversation, y'all are policing each other pretty hardcore and forcing each other to step up or shut up, which is a whole other ballgame. But at least providing a place for honest education and a neutral place for you and younger people to get skills and to learn how to debate and to approach conversations is better than having an indoctrinated education system as well as an indoctrination social milieu.
Yeah, I think if something like a CRT-based curriculum gets legitimized you're going to see a lot of enabling of that sort of animosity between students. I think it's just going to further enable that sort of bullying, or like that sort of like kind of like cliquey ideological behavior. And like one thing that's like really like kind of scary too is that like because the whole point of K through 12 education is to provide students with hard skills or like technical skills that will serve them well in their university and in their career beyond university. But if CRT is being proposed or like promoted as being sort of college prep, then what does that say about universities? You know, like to be indoctrinated into, or like
okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, if students,
it's like a prereq to get along with the university environment, is to know how to think along these terms.
Yeah, and I think it says really horrible things about like the standards of academia right now. Very concerning things. I think that like, you know, there is too much interpersonal sensitivities getting hyper encouraged, and like the fact that like racial sensitivity and racial theory is like considered college prep really, I think, speaks to a sort of like derailing of academic, like real academic goals or material, tangible academic goals. I mean, numeracy, I think I wrote in my article that numeracy and literacy rates in this country are like honestly dwindling. You know, I think of 300 million or so 330 million or so Americans in the country, around like a generous estimate's like about 50 million or so, 43 million read below a third grade level.
And that's adults.
That's adults.
Yeah.
And I mean, those adults, there's nothing preventing those adults from having children. You know, like we don't live in a country where people are sterilized on the basis of IQ, which would be horrible in and of itself. But at the same time, that sort of lends itself to these students, their children growing up in homes where their parents are illiterate, you know, and they're going to school and everything they learn, like they're being, you know, taught sort of ideology rather than technical skills that they can, you know, actually.
They're being taught to change the world, not necessarily to understand it, which is not necessarily a recipe for success.
You know, I did terribly in calculus in high school, but I was shocked. Like, you know, I thought I was going to be the most, you know, like numerically illiterate person at my university because I got a D in calculus my senior year of high school, and then I found out there were so many people who didn't even take, like, they didn't even take, you know, like they didn't even take calculus. Like that's not a standard anymore. And this isn't to say that, you know, everyone must understand calculus to like an extreme degree, and like, you know, you need to be extremely like mathematically literate, but like the fact that like those skills aren't being prioritized relative to like, you know, AP government or like understanding like racial discourse, I think that's like really sad. You know, I think it's really sad that a lot of people really struggled with understanding statistical information at my school, but had no issue writing at length about like racial inequity.
Which,
it's like really scary.
How do you understand that without statistical understanding, other than I guess you understand it ideologically, not statistically?
Yeah, I think you're ending up with a lot of university students who only understand things at an ideological level. They don't really understand things at an objective level. So, and man, I had a class session that was on I had a class on pluralism, and we had to discuss marketing techniques, I think at some point, as in like marketing techniques for certain political interests, I guess. And we were just talking about, you know, like those sort of politics in a pluralist society. And one of the, it was on racial insensitivity in ads or something like that. At some point got to that. And we were discussing how, like, is it okay for X group to appropriate racial identity or appropriate some other element of identity in order to further some other goal, even if that goal is productive or good, ostensibly. And I think we had to analyze an ad on, like, it was like a Haagen-Dazs ad on protecting the bees, and like the guy in the video was dressed as a Jamaican man, like it was like a white guy dressed Jamaican, and he was rapping in a Jamaican accent. And you know, this campaign that the Haagen-Dazs did, like they were able to organize and raise several $1 million for like a Save the Bees sort of initiative. And people in my class were like mocking and laughing at it because that one ad was racially insensitive, you know? And I think I spoke up in class and said that I thought, in spite of its racial insensitivity, it was actually quite like effective. It was really effective, and it worked quite well, and it was to broadly for the material benefits of it were immutable, I think, or like inarguable. But then this one girl got really angry with me and said that I was allowing for cultural appropriation. I don't think she realized I was Jamaican, so I didn't really, I didn't actually care. I don't look visibly, I think, black, so like a lot of people really would assume that I was Asian and get really mad at me. And like that's what I mean when kids are learning, like they're not learning to think objectively, they're learning to think in terms of ideology. They think they need to prioritize their ideology over like actual productivity. It's kind of insane, you know, like they and with like dwindling, like 53 or so million people reading below a third grade level is concerning enough as is, but then that is sort of like that sort of speaks to how many people are reading below like an 8th grade level. It makes me really curious about that. How many people are reading below a 12th grade level? And like to some degree, you know, are there people proliferating these sort of like really left progressive ideas that actually, like, are there definitely people that just parrot these as, you know, bullet points? Do they actually understand what they're saying? Do they understand the implications of what they're saying?
Well, like, and to what degree do they understand it? To what degree can they conceptualize and think through it? If a 6th grade level, 8th grade level, 12th grade level, a master's degree level, right?
Yeah. I think it was Abigail Schreier who talked about it a bit, where it was like the average sort of 18-year-old now has like the mental and emotional capacity of a 15-year-old in 1980. And I think that says a really, really terrifying things about, you know, the sort of material being published by like universities now. Like they're, like in some respects, it feels like they're publishing the work of like people who are technically underskilled and also emotionally underskilled or emotionally underdeveloped. So I don't really know. I feel like that's probably a massive problem. You have diversity officers that can't read very well, actually. And that's not.
So how much more of this schooling are you going to put up with?
Probably what I can do to get my degree. So yeah, I'll probably get a degree, and then I'm considering higher education, grad school. I think there's way more freedom at the grad school level now than there is at the undergraduate level. So I had to take an evolutionary anthropology class or environmental anthropology course. And I had so much trouble in that class because we were talking about Foucault and like, you know, whether or not like living in a technologically like underdeveloped society is actually happier because we're not destroying the environment or something like that. And I couldn't keep up with the logic of the class, and I didn't do very well. So, you know, like I made the argument that like, you know, living in like a sort of like primitive society, like the more like not dying of, you know, say like the common cold is actually like really great. You know, I really enjoy like the technological like benefits that we have now, the like, you know, medical technology we have in like a developed society. And my professor was like, well, would you really be like, what if you just didn't know that existed though? Like if you live in a primitive society, you wouldn't know about penicillin, so you wouldn't know that's an option. And therefore, wouldn't you have a happier life? And I just like couldn't keep up in the class.
So their argument was that ignorance is bliss?
Yes, in a certain sense.
And this is a professor arguing for ignorance.
It was an anthropology course, so the whole thing was to be relativistic in the way that we understood primitive societies and to not be judgmental of like their, I guess, failings relative to developed society. But at a certain point, when are you just lying to yourself? You know, like, yeah, you know, the people living in African tribal communities who aren't aware of like antibiotics, are they living a better life because they're ignorant?
Well, do you have to go to the next level and say, if you want to argue their point for them, say, well, why don't we just start, instead of reverting to primitive society, why don't we just malnourish children so they don't have the capacity to know what they're missing out on?
Yeah.
Right? So they can't develop beyond a certain mental capacity.
Yeah, and that's how I got like a C in that class. It definitely is very hard to write. Like we had to do like different responses, and I just couldn't keep up with like the rationale for like sort of like, you know.
So it was basically a training in a certain rationalization. It wasn't a place where you could argue. You actually got demerited for thinking differently than they wanted you to think.
As in, like, it was kind of like, I feel like I definitely got portrayed as like not understanding the material particularly well. And it wasn't that I didn't understand the material, I just disagreed with the basis in which it was written.
Okay. Yeah.
And I felt like I couldn't argue that at all. We had to read an article about like kind of like how Western colonialism brought alcoholism to Zimbabwe, former Rhodesia. And it was just kind of like, okay, at what point are African people unable to be considered individuals with agency to make decisions? You know, like I made the suggestion that we couldn't attribute alcoholism in like, you know, colonial communities to like colonialism itself, and then I got shot down for that, or told that I wasn't understanding the article quite well, and it was just, no, I'm disagreeing with the basis in which the article was written, but you couldn't make that argument at all. You know?
What do you do with, are you like Zen in those moments? Do you get like really frustrated, and what do you do with your frustration? Or are you just Zen?
I call up my mom. I could say. My mom is like 60, so she's much older than my professor. My professors would be described as millennials, a lot of them.
Yeah.
Like, I just honestly think that millennial politics is going to cause an insane, like, right-wing reaction from people, like, younger than me or around my age. Because I also had another philosophy professor tell me that he would prefer a Senate that was all female, because women are less inclined to war or discrimination. This was like someone with a really like developed career in philosophy, so it was just kind of like, ooh, like this is the state of academia right now. This is someone.
Yeah, when you were saying about considering going to grad school because maybe there's more freedom, I'm sorry to break it to you, girl. I think it's elephants all the way up.
I just thought that like grad students would be more inclined to disagreement, because at least at the undergrad level, I feel like everyone is just trying to get a degree. You know, everyone's just
what
trying to get.
What do you think the master's degree students are doing? I'm sorry. I think, when we were talking about failing institutions, academia is, with the state of the federal loans and all that stuff, and the infrastructure and the admin bloat, and then the subpar offerings, and then how they're actually treating teachers, both ideologically and with just denying tenure. It's rickety. It's rickety to the extreme, especially with a bunch of smart people getting kicked out or avoiding it. There will be an alternative at some point. I don't know what we're going to do about accreditation and in-person learning, but there will be. There will be. That will be the most. If we could just destroy anything and rebuild it, I think the best thing to do would just be academia. I think we could get away with it, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. It wouldn't nobody would die. People would just have to actually learn skills that.
Did you hear about the Austin Tong case? I think his name is Austin Tong. It went viral on Fox News over the summer. He was.
How do you spell the last name?
Tong.
Okay. Austin Tong.
Let me see if I can find him too. Yeah, he was like basically like he goes to my university. He was a year older than me, and he ended up getting into like really like extreme trouble at my university because he posted a photo of himself holding a AR-15 of some kind during the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, because he was a Chinese immigrant, he's a Chinese immigrant, and he just really wanted to celebrate the fact that like immigrating to the United States, he was given like the right to protect himself, I guess. And people at my school reported him, and I think school police actually showed up to his home in Connecticut. And it turned into a massive like legal battle, and he was able to kind of like really profit off of it because of like a lot of people on Fox News really took on his his narrative as like a grift, but like it kind of says a lot about like education now. I think that a student could get into trouble for possessing a gun. I think he got in trouble on the basis of promoting bias and hate crimes.
What?
Yeah.
By standing up to the CCP?
Yeah.
Or giving them the middle finger?
And it was bad. Like, And I honestly think it was, I just think it was bullying because he was on student government and I was the head of a few clubs that year. So I was kind of involved in student government, but only to the extent that I had to go to them for administrative things. And a lot of the people in student government hated him. They hated him as a person. They just didn't like him because he was really conservative. Like he was
he came from communist freaking China.
Yeah, he is shockingly very pro-capitalist, American,
freedom.
Yeah, he loves it. And now they just hated this kid and they saw that he posted a gun and they thought that he was threatening the the liberal kids at my school. They thought basically the progressive kids at my school thought that he was threatening them, especially during Black Lives Matter, that it was a threat against African American students, which is really funny because Austin is pretty nice. I genuinely don't think he actually cares at all about racial issues. I think he just really wanted to show off his gun. But yeah, he got suspended from school and everything.
Oh, and then he sued?
He sued and then the judge dismissed his case.
Oh, okay.
So it didn't really go. I don't think it went anywhere, and it didn't go anywhere in his favor. Yeah.
Well, we should wrap up the episode because it is an episode, and I can't sing your praises high enough. You should definitely consider submitting your articles to magazines and online places. They are a little headier than the normal stuff, which I love. So you're gonna have to figure out the right publication. But you are a rising star. You are absolutely a rising star. I'm gonna look back on this episode and say I had her here first.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that means a lot. I'm really grateful that a lot of people. I'm really grateful that my writing's really resonating with people. It means a lot. I'm glad that people feel the same way.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.